Climate Action Alliance. I want to thank everyone who has been a part of this webinar series, including our participants who have signed in not only from the Gulf Coast region, but also from Dallas, Starkville, Mississippi, New York, Canada, New Hampshire, and Bristol, England. I personally have renewed hope for humanity in the collective wisdom that we are tapping into and the community we are forming to care for our Earth home. The first thing that I'm going to do is a land acknowledgement. We are present in Mobile on the Chattahoochee native land of the Choctaw Nation, and those who are in Baldwin County are present on the Muskogee land of the Creek Nation. We are grateful to those who came before us. This session's theme is "We need courage, not hope, to fight climate change." It will be a conversation between our two speakers, followed by questions from the audience. Throughout the session, both the question and answer and the chat features will be available to the audience, and we ask that you use the chat if you need to ask questions of the event organizers, and reserve the Q&A box for any questions that you have for our two speakers. We anticipate this event will last until 3 p.m. or maybe a little longer if there are many questions. I'm going to ask Anna Jane and Michael to turn their cameras on now. Let me begin by introducing our speakers. Anna Jane Joyner is passionate about crafting stories and strategies that inspire new and non-traditional audiences to take action on climate change. Her work has been featured by Rolling Stone, Glamour, MTV, the Associated Press, and more. Anna Jane's efforts to engage evangelicals, including her own father, a prominent pastor, was featured in Years of Living Dangerously, an Emmy Award-winning Showtime series on the climate crisis. She is the co-founder of Creation Care Alliance of Western North Carolina and has organized faith communities to take action on everything from moving beyond coal, ending mountaintop removal coal mining in Appalachia, water pollution, federal climate policy, protecting the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge, and more. Currently, she is the co-host of No Place Like Home, a podcast that gets to the heart of climate change. They just released a new Bring the Light season that explores spirituality and the climate crisis. She's also the founder of the Good Energy Project, a budding initiative to support writers and producers in integrating climate stories into TV and film. Welcome, Anna Jane. And the Reverend Michael Malcom is the Executive Director of Alabama Interfaith Power and Light. He is a licensed and ordained United Church of Christ minister. He recently resigned as the senior pastor of Rush Memorial Congregation, UCC in Atlanta, Georgia, to give full-time attention to his environmental work. Reverend Malcom also received an MBA from Terry School of Business at the University of Georgia and completed a Postmaster's Human Resource Management course at Cornell University. He is also the founder of Martha's Corner Incorporated and the People's Justice Council, which are 501c3 nonprofits, and the environmental justice representative for the Southeast Conference of the United Church of Christ. Reverend Malcom is currently the co-chair of the Building Power from the Grassroots Task Force with Climate Action Network International, and the co-chair of the Environmental Justice Working Group for the Southeast Climate and Energy Network. Michael's varied experience is coalescing in a powerful way to create an unparalleled opportunity for faith communities in Alabama to unite and raise their voice against environmental injustice and climate change. I'm going to ask Michael to open us with a prayer.
Let us pray. Great Spirit, you are known by many names. You are seen in many lights. Today we humble ourselves in your presence. Center us in community and speak to us afresh. Speak today so that your stewards will find strength, joy, and courage. Strength to continue fighting for justice and equity. Joy in knowing that we are making a difference. And courage to stand no matter how dark the times may get. Today we listen in faith and receive in faith. Amen.
Amen. Let's start first with you, Anna Jane. Your story begins with a father who is a nationally known evangelical megachurch pastor, weaves through the Appalachian Mountains of your childhood to the wonder and beauty of New Zealand as a young adult agnostic, and now unfolds as a storyteller for people of faith and all spiritual persuasions on the Gulf Coast of Alabama. Tell us a little bit more about your story and what brought you to the work of caring for our Earth home.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. First of all, it's an honor to be here. I grew up, my dad is an evangelical megachurch pastor. He's actually kind of charismatic Pentecostal, which those of you familiar with that tradition know that it adds a different kind of layer to even the more conservative evangelical church. So it was a very conservative, very evangelical, very Pentecostal upbringing. Definitely never talked much about the environment, or certainly not climate change, or really justice issues in general. You know, I was very focused on kind of the next life or this sort of supernatural realm. And I think the one thing my parents did do well that I mean, they did lots of things well. They also made lots of mistakes. But as far as environmental care goes, is they raised us in the Western North Carolina mountains. So in the Blue Ridge Mountains, which are just magical. They call them the Old Wise Mountains. And then here on the Gulf Coast, we spent the summers down here, which is where my mother's family is from, the Alabama, kind of midway between Mobile and Pensacola, but on the Alabama side. And it's just an absolutely breathtaking place and place to spend summers. It's not quite as breathtaking now after that hurricane because we had 24 trees down, but I'm sure once it cleans up, it'll be back to being gorgeous. And so, yeah, I grew up, even though I didn't have an environmental ethic, we had a deep love of nature and spent a lot of time in nature. And so as I was kind of coming into my teenage years, I think I've always been like someone who really kind of loves this earth and this life and this experience. Like I was very curious. I read a lot of books, and the kind of Pentecostal evangelical tradition just, it never really resonated with me that much, but it certainly stopped resonating with me as I kind of came into my own as a young adult. And I think one of my friends who he was actually a Pentecostal pastor and then became an environmentalist. He's a mentor. His name is Peter Ilian. But he tells this great story about how he was at like one of those sort of Christian rock festivals. And the guy, the lead singer, was sort of playing his guitar and lamenting how horrible this world is and how we can't wait to get to heaven. And the whole time Peter was just sitting there being like, dude, have you like ever eaten a peach? Like this world is so beautiful. And obviously it's also got a lot of darkness, but it also has so much beauty. And how could you just wish that away? And how like disrespectful to the creator to wish that away. So yeah, that's kind of how I ended up. I went to college. I went to UNC Chapel Hill. I happened to study abroad in New Zealand, which is all, in addition to the Gulf Coast of Alabama and Western North Carolina, the other most beautiful place in the world. And just happened to take an ecology course because I thought it would be easier than the science curriculum at UNC Chapel Hill. And I think that combined with the fact that we were running around in some of the most beautiful mountains in the world, and also it was the first time I could vote, and it was the Bush-Kerry election. And I just assumed I was a Republican because my parents were. We were proud Republicans. Both sides of the family were. And all my friends were like from New Zealand or the West Coast of the United States or Europe, and they were like, you can't vote for a war criminal. And I was like, well, maybe I should do some research on this. And took one of those online courses and figured out that I wasn't a Republican and I was an environmentalist. So yeah, that's kind of how I got into it. I went back to UNC Chapel Hill, and that's really where my kind of love of the earth, I really was kind of a spiritual experience. Like I can remember the day where I really felt it when I was in New Zealand. It was kind of a gray, dark, misty day, but we were up in Arthur's Pass, and it just kind of felt this aliveness and this connection to some sort of spirituality that I hadn't felt in a long time, because I'd kind of become a heathen in my later teenage, early 20s. And that, I don't know, it really, really touched me. And I just knew there's some deep part of me that just knew that this was my calling. This was what I was called to do. And so I went back to UNC Chapel Hill, and that's where I really learned about all of the horrible things we're doing to the earth. So everything, mountaintop removal, coal mining was probably the one that first gripped me, because I grew up in the Appalachian Mountains, and it affects communities near me, not only destroying these ancient mountains, like God's creation, but also poisoning the communities that were, very similar to mine in a lot of ways. But after that, I worked on coal ash. I worked on a kind of a myriad of different environmental issues, and climate change was always one of them. Like it was always one in the basket of environmental issues that I cared about and worked on. But it was actually in my later 20s where I kind of bounced around working for both different faith-based environmental initiatives and organizations. Because I was raised evangelical, I did have this sort of unique perspective and understanding of faith communities, and also networks and connections. I had access to high-level, conservative leaders through my dad, and so that sort of launched me in this kind of weird mixture of environmentalism and faith-based activism, which thankfully has now grown into a much bigger deal than when I was first starting. And then basically I was back in Western North Carolina working as the campaigns director for the regional environmental nonprofit there. And I had started this amazing group of churches and pastors, the Western North Carolina Creation Care Alliance, which is very similar to the work that you're doing. And that's when I started working on the documentary, which was climate focused. And we basically tried to get my dad to believe in climate change. And I won't tell you the ending, but I will say it was complicated. And through that, just started reading all the most recent, climate literature and reports, and was like, oh, this can't just be one of the things on my menu anymore. Like, I felt like I was painting the room of a house with a wrecking ball outside. And so that's when I really, focused full time on climate, and have continued both doing work with, everyone from NASCAR fans to yogis, but lots of work with particularly millennial evangelicals. And I also did a lot of work with Catholics around the encyclical. So kind of continue the faith-based work, but I've also moved more into kind of the storytelling and communications part of climate activism, and have this podcast, which you guys should check out, because we've just did this beautiful season on spirituality and climate and touch on a lot of these themes. But yeah, that's kind of what landed me here. And we moved back to the Gulf Coast, or really moved. I'd never lived here as an adult. We'd only ever spent the summers here, but we moved down here around 4 years ago. And it's been something I've really wanted to do, is to work more locally within Alabama and on the Gulf Coast, because obviously there's a lot of needs here. So when Rhoda reached out to me and was like, we're starting this thing, and it's so exciting to me that this is happening here, and that, just to be a part of it. I'm really grateful to all of you. So that's tidbits of my story.
Rhoda, you're on mute.
Thank you, Michael. We're really glad to have you here in Alabama, Anna Jane, and really glad to have you help us with our inaugural event here in this fledgling organization that we've started. So I'm going to turn to Michael, and your story starts in the Pentecostal holiness tradition and has taken you from a pastor's care of community to an advocate's call for justice and care of our planet. Tell us more about your story and what brought you to this work.
So while in seminary at the Interdenominational Theological Center, I met a woman by the name of Rev Susan Mitchell, and we began to talk about the United Church of Christ. And the United Church of Christ was more in line with my theological understanding and belief than my Pentecostal upbringing because of their call to justice and emphasis thereon. And so I really started looking into justice as my theological understanding of who God is and Christ's message. And it was later on that I was sitting in a conference at Emory University, and Reverend Dr. Gerald Durley, who is now one of my dearest mentors, and Reverend Kate Mosley, who's also one of my dearest mentors, as well as the chair of the board for the People's Justice Council. But Reverend Dr. Gerald Durley said this. He said, "How can I preach to them in the pulpit, shout them in the pews, but they can't breathe out in public?" And that right there quickened something in me. And it immediately caused me to connect my faith with what's happening in public life and to connect my theology. So my theology became more of a public theology, where I look at what's happening in our society and try to see how it aligns up with the will of the Creator. And in doing so, it inspires me at times to write. It inspires me definitely to organize and to advocate, and it also inspires me to train. And so in those times and stepping into those roles, I've now gotten full-fledged into this movement. As I look out and see the things that are happening throughout our society, I can't help but to get involved.
Thank you. We appreciate the work you do too, and we're anxious for Gulf Coast Creation Care to work in partnership with Alabama Interfaith Power and Light so that we don't reinvent the wheel.
Yes, I'm anxious to be working with you all as well. I was excited when you first reached out to me about it, and since then life has just taken off. It seems like it was maybe 3 years ago that you did it, although it was only a few months ago. But somehow, according to COVID years, we're now like dog years. So it's moving real fast.
Yeah.
And slow at the same time.
It seems to me like when it comes to climate change, we've almost passed a critical mass point where the world is starting to wake up to something that climate scientists and other advocates have been pushing for a long time. And it looks like a lot of people are waking up to it, so that's a good thing. I'm going to ask the first question and of our panelists today, and let them answer as they see fit. There's no order you have to go in. We are addressing an interfaith audience. Each of you has had experience with faith communities addressing creation care. And many people who care about climate change are overwhelmed with the scope of the task before them and don't know what they can do to help. What approaches do you suggest our communities, our faith communities, start with to inspire our own members to action?
I'll go first if that's okay with you, and on that one. I really believe that it's about building relationships. That's the most important and the first step. We can't parachute in and try to fix anything, but we've got to build relationships so that when we do build resistance, we're doing it from a place of what the community wants, and not from a place of what we think they need. Oftentimes our policies miss community because of us not consulting with community. And so they have ill effect, or they are inept. Um, and so, yeah, the first thing that I would tell us as communities of faith, and even dealing with our own membership, is to build those relationships so you can hear the pain of the people and you can speak to that directly.
Yeah, I wholeheartedly agree with that, Reverend Malcolm. And also just wanted to mention it's amazing that we both come from Pentecostal backgrounds. We should catch up sometime and talk that through. And Reverend Dr. Gerald Durley has also been a huge inspiration with me. I've only met him once on a panel in Atlanta, but it was one of the most remarkable experiences of my life. So, but yeah, in answer to your question, Rhoda, I think, so as an activist, I'm gonna say, I would, I think oftentimes what I've seen with faith communities is they sort of err towards the, let's start a recycling program, or, kind of the behavioral change types of things that you can do, which I think are great for getting people involved, but you just can't stop there, because for one, I think it's a little bit of, there's definitely a strong argument to be made that focusing on our own personal choices above systematic injustice and systematic change is actually like a strategy by the fossil fuels companies to disempower us. If you can get people feeling guilty and ashamed of having to drink watered bottles, which I've had to do for the past week and a half because we haven't had clean water since this hurricane, then you take away their energy for the real fight, which is changing our systems and changing our policies. And so I would say, even if you do all these great personal change, offer canvas bags or cleanups or whatever it is, community gardens, like always pair that with an opportunity to get involved in some form of activism, whether that's writing letters or even like the churches that I worked with in Western North Carolina, and some of them, we really offered, I think, kind of 3 tracks, and not at all to say that you guys have to do it the same way, because there's so many different ways. And I totally agree. It's really about the community and what the community needs and what the community is passionate about. But, a lot of churches were excited about the kind of food injustice and creating community gardens and better food networks for the communities in Western North Carolina, because that was a big need. And then we had a whole lot of pastors and lay people who are really passionate about the pastoral care and offering spaces for people to not only be inspired and connected to their faith traditions, but also to grieve, because that is one thing that faith traditions offer that traditional activism doesn't, is how to process these really hard, confusing, scary emotions. And I think that as we're facing more and more climate impacts, as people are waking up more and more, we're going to need a lot more of that. Like, we're going to need ministers and people who know how to help, build community and allow people to process and work through, or even just listen to people experiencing the anxieties and the fear around all this, and also the courage and the hope. But then I'd say the third one is advocacy. Like, we had, there were churches who organized small groups to go meet with their local congressperson. Even really, like, Mark Meadows was one of our congress people who's now the chief of staff, and like, we didn't convince him on climate, but we got him to open up some on agriculture and needing to have better environmental issues on agriculture. And the big campaign I worked on in Asheville was to retire our local coal plant and to clean up the coal ash pollution, which I know Mobile is dealing with as well. And we had a group of about 40 pastors sign on to a letter that we printed in the Asheville Citizen Times as an op-ed. And then they went to the shareholders meeting and delivered it in person to the CEO of Duke Energy. And she was like, oh, wow. I read your op-ed. I know who you guys are. And she was so, like, this woman who was over the largest energy company in the world, was like, these guys, I need to pay attention to, this group of 40 pastors from Western North Carolina. So you can use your power from an authentic place of being a person of faith for advocacy and for kind of contributing to our civic power and our civic duty. And that I think is also very important. So that would be my answers.
Yeah, you know, when we started this organization, our mission statement was to stimulate amongst the Gulf Coast citizens to highlight the moral imperative that we have to do something about climate change. And because we're a faith-based organization and there's many people doing many things, but we thought our lane would be to highlight that, to awaken in people to see that that it is important for faith communities to see the moral imperative of doing something about it. Not only for the fact that it's God's creation that we should be taking care of, but also those impacted most by climate change are the marginalized portions of society, which the church is mandated to care for. So, yeah, go ahead.
Rhoda, actually, I wanted to pick up on something that Anna Jane talked about, which is the advocacy portion of it. One of the things that we have to realize as communities of faith, and in particular faith leaders, is we have a perfect opportunity to step in and change this whole conversation. Unfortunately, society has politicized climate change. It's politicized the pandemic. It's politicized social justice. And we've got to take that out of the arena of politicization and put it back into the arena of morality to say, is this right or wrong? Is it right or wrong that we pollute communities who and have polluting facilities and communities that they can't even get jobs in? Or is it right or wrong that we have communities of consumerism or produce in communities that destroy communities, and while at the same time taking away the property tax because of subsidies? I mean, we have to look at it and ask the questions, is it right or wrong? Not if it's politically correct, not even if it's economically feasible, but is this right or wrong? Is it right or wrong that we know the science and we continue to live in the way that we live and continue to have the systems of injustice that cause us to be in the place that we're in? And how dare we sit in ignorance purposely? And so for us as communities of faith, and in particular now, with all that's going on, our voice is needed more than anything, if for no other reason, just to change this conversation.
Yeah. I'm gonna,
Amen.
since we have highlighted or spoken a little bit about some local issues, I'm going to skip down to that question and have a little bit of a conversation about some local things that are going on. And I know, Michael, you're involved in a few of these things, and Anna Jane, you can jump in too where you feel comfortable. But the Africatown paper mill pollution is one of our local issues here. The Berry coal ash pond. I know several of us in this group have been involved in writing the Public Service Commission to try to get them to change their stance on solar energy, and the wood pellet industry is another local issue. So what do you know about those local issues that you could highlight for us, and maybe inform us a little bit more than we already are informed about these?
Is that question for me, Rhoda, or for Anna?
Yeah. And,
Okay.
and Jane can jump in if she wants to as well.
So Anna, I will definitely let you speak on the sea level rise and whatnot. I know you're probably a lot more familiar with that than I am. I know with Africatown, they are a historically Black town, and it's an older community. And they are right now fighting against Kimberly Clark and polluting industries in Africa Town who are trying to basically take over the land and pollute the land and be zoned to make it industrial land instead of it being residential. And so they're fighting rezoning or repurposing their land so that they can continue to live their lives the way that they've been doing it in this historically black town that was founded by slaves. Uh, and with the coal ash, that's not something that I'm directly involved in, though I know the people who are leading it and do plan on being a part in writing letters and advocating for it. And even attending the hearing, which is coming up. And I'm sorry, I can't remember the exact date on that. Now, with the Public Service Commission, which is what I really focus on with Alabama Interfaith Power and Light, we've started Energize Alabama, where we're helping residents pay utility bills, in particular those vulnerable residents, because of the lack of programs that are available. But at the same time, we're also advocating against policy that caused them to be in this place in the first place. In Alabama, we have one of the highest rate energy burdens or disproportionate energy burden impacts. Uh, we're one of the poorest states as far as wages are concerned and living is concerned. Uh, but we're one of the highest states as far as energy burdens are concerned. So what that basically equates down to is those who are already in vulnerable positions are paying between 8 to 10% of their income towards their energy bills or towards their utilities. And as of September 28th, which is tomorrow, they're going back to energy shutoffs unless you sign up to this certain program, which for those who are already sitting in vulnerable positions, you've not only put them economically in a position that keeps them in the cycle of poverty, but you've also mandated that they go back and put themselves in harm's way so that they can make sure that their kids stay cool for the least time that it's still hot and make sure that they can stay warm when it gets cold, which is happening right now. So you've got people who are in present day, it have present day issues because of the policies that favor those who make profit instead of people in planet here in Alabama. And sorry to carry on, but in addition to, there's a vote that they could take that puts energy efficiency in place for those homes that aren't energy, homes and buildings that aren't energy efficient, which one lowers the rates. Also, not only does it lower the rates, but also it would help bring down the emissions for the planet, and so we can have double impact with that. Uh, and in addition, solar. If you put solar on your home and you're feeding back to the grid, you can actually make revenue from that, and your bill will be lower if they don't have this bully tax in place that prevents people from seeing the benefits of putting solar on their homes. So, for those who are already vulnerable, this is a perfect way to bring them out of that poverty. I believe that faith communities are essential in this conversation because this speaks to our daily lives. Give us this day our daily bread. We are there to help serve that daily bread. And that's what our advocating does.
Michael, what can we do other than the letters we've written to this point? I know I did the Al Gore's climate reality leader training this summer, and one of my co-students was a member of the Arkansas Public Service Commission, and she told us that she is aware that our Twinkle Kavanaugh is getting pressure from all of the public service commissions in our area because we're the only ones who are so antagonistic to solar. And I was just wondering if there's anything else that we can do to push this along.
Well, again, for me, I'm not only advocating for solar by writing letters and making the phone calls, but also showing up. Why can't you call a meeting and have some virtual meetings with Twinkie Kavanaugh? If she's willing to meet with you. If she's not, why not shame her about not meeting with? Why won't you meet with us? You know, for me, we've got to strengthen our advocacy again, not to be passive advocates, but to be aggressive advocates for what's happening. We've got to move with a sense of urgency and act as if though our house is truly on fire. That's the only way we're gonna move this needle. They have political power, they have economic power, but we have people power. And people power trumps all of that because we put them in office and we can get them out of office. And we've got to let them know that. I hope that answers your question.
Yes.
Yeah, and I'll just jump in to add to what you were saying, Reverend Malcom, on the coal ash pine. I've been to a couple of meetings with the Sierra Club in Mobile on it, but I wish that I knew more, and I would love to hear more about the upcoming hearing, because this was a big fight that we fought in North Carolina, and we were successful. And eventually, after a year, I mean, I think it was like a 7-year fight, we got the North Carolina state legislator to force Duke Energy to clean up, I think, the 14 coal ash ponds in North Carolina that were leaching toxic water into the ground, to nearby waterways, the French Broad River where I live, but also into communities. People were drinking poisoned water, and that is very much happening here in Alabama for sure. If not even, I think it might even it might be one of the few worst states that North Carolina was on the coal ash front. And I do know, just from the few meetings I've been to on the Berry coal ash pond, that it's even closer to the river than ours was in Asheville. So it's leaching into the river at greater rates. Also, if one of these big hurricanes, like we saw with Sally, that's super wet and super powerful, hits that coal ash pine, it would release 20 times the amount of pollution that the Gulf oil spill did into the Mobile Bay, which is, of course, not only a massive environmental problem, it's also a huge economic problem. It would shut down the port. So there's a lot of really good arguments for getting that coal ash plant cleaned up, and I would love to help out on that front. And then on the climate change front, I mean, I think, where we are and kind of we're on Perdido Bay, so a little bit closer to the Florida border, but we've already seen about 10 inches of sea level rise, according to scientists. We are likely to see 2 feet by the middle of the century, which is, of course, within our lifetimes, certainly within our kids' lifetimes. And that means not only is that just creating infrastructure problems on good days, it means storm surges are going to get a lot worse. And it's really going to be a massive challenge for the Gulf Coast. There are probably communities that won't be able to withstand it. And we know, just to give you an example, from this past storm, Sally, which hit us straight on, and I know hit Mobile badly as well as Pensacola, where I'm sitting right now. So according to Eric Holthouse, who's one of the greatest climate journalists, and he's also a meteorologist, he said that we're going to see these wetter storms. We're going to see these slower storms. Those are both directly related to climate. So what we saw with Harvey and then Florence and now Sally, these slow wet storms are going to become more and more of a problem. And then we're also, because the Gulf water is the hottest it's ever been, like in the history of humanity, we're going to see more of these quickly intensifying storms, which is going to dramatically change the way that people on the Gulf Coast need to be thinking about hurricanes. Like, we can't really think about it in the case of like category 1 to 5, or like I survived Ivan and therefore I can survive X number of storm, because them being slower and wetter, as we saw with Sally, they can be just as dangerous. You know, our storm surge was worse with Sally than it was with Ivan, which was a much more powerful storm. So that means anything from like a baby tropical storm, you know, could intensify quickly and become a much more dangerous one. So that's a big change. I actually think we need a pretty big education campaign advising the Gulf Coast that we really need to start thinking differently about how we evacuate from hurricanes. Because a lot of my neighbors, you know, they don't leave unless it's a high 5, you know, and that's just not the way my whole neighborhood should have been evacuated. You know, it was a war zone. It's still a war zone. And we were lucky to have our houses standing. A lot of my neighbors, you know, were completely flooded or had trees fall on them, and it was very dangerous. And that's, so basically we need to change the way we think about hurricanes. And also we really need to work on climate resilience in this region. You know, we are certainly on the front lines of climate change, and we don't have any good policies or state or federal leadership helping us think about how to build more resilient communities so that we can face these coming storms in both metaphorical and literal senses. And then the last thing I'll say, which is probably the most critical part, is these are huge justice issues. Like, even in this past storm, like I'm lucky to have a great family who's very involved. So I had a bunch of cousins come down, and right now 3 of my siblings are here cleaning up, and we had teams of volunteers who just came and helped us and helped our property that we had connections with. You know, like my cousin's baseball coaches came down. But for a lot, and we also are some of the privileged people who could afford to evacuate, which we should have and will do from now on. And also, if we have to relocate because this just gets to be too much of a dangerous, harrowing situation, and in the future, we can afford to do that. But a lot of my neighbors are not in that circumstance. They don't have transportation. They can't evacuate for any number of reasons. Obviously, our public transportation down here is terrible. And also, if we need if they need to move, they don't have places to go, and they don't have the means to relocate. So yeah, just some food for thought on kind of climate and related justice issues here in the South. It's certainly going to increasingly affect us. So I'm really glad you guys are building this movement of faith communities to help.
Rhoda, one thing that I've recognized in doing this work, in particular working with communities of faith, we do very well when it comes down to looking up. We have a hard time looking out though. So our worship is, you know, top notch. We can put on a real good worship show. But when it comes down to looking out with things that are happening in society, we have a growing edge there. And so one of the other things that I think we could do, and we probably could do this rapidly, for those who are all like-minded, why don't we get together and create a newsletter so we can let people know in our communities of faith, throughout our communities of faith, throughout Alabama, let them know what's happening around Alabama. A lot of people, when I'm going and I'm talking and training, they'll say, wow, I didn't know that was taking place. I didn't know that was happening. And it's happening in their own communities, but they don't know it. And it's because they come into the 4 walls, they have worship, and then they go home and they ignore, you know, the distance between their vehicle and the church. So they're not looking at what's happening in the community that their church is centered in. And so they don't even know what's going on. So maybe we could get together and start up a newsletter where we just publish it out to you know, communities of faith, no matter what community of faith you are. So you'll know what's happening around Alabama and in particular your community.
I think that's a good idea. And I think that one of our major tasks initially is to connect and to solidify our relationships, to create a foundation for us to go forward on, for sure. I'd like to move to a little bit different angle now, that's more centered around the topic of our day today, which is how do we find courage, and talk a little bit about the paralysis and despair that we feel when we're informing ourselves about climate change. And I'm going to pause us just for a moment and give us a little 3-minute treat here. We're going to watch a video that speaks to this issue, and then we'll come back after the video and let Anna, Jane, and Michael give us their thoughts on it. So we're all going to turn off our cameras right now, and I'm going to share my screen.
I think we've been given a false choice between the story of hope and the false choice is that they're both true. You know, I study language and I study culture, and I try to help people create strategies around the stories that they tell. And one of the things I learned in the early days of trying to communicate about climate change was that reframing climate change required us to not talk about climate change. And instead, we need to talk about what it means to be human. And we need to talk about how economies work. The other thing that I learned was that global warming as an idea is inherently traumatizing. It hurts us. So what we have to do is prepare ourselves for some trauma. Because global warming, while traumatizing, is also real. And so this false choice between the story of hope or the story of doom misses that the combining of the two, of a story of authentic, painful struggle worth having, is the story that ignites hope. And it ignites hope because we embrace the struggle and the pain, and we don't run from it. And the realization that this is the story that we've been waiting for, and it is a story that is not yet written, and so we can't tell it, is something that a lot of people also miss. You know, people ask me, what story would you tell for the new paradigm? And I tell them, you can't tell a story that hasn't happened yet. The way that we frame this story is by living it. We don't create the story by telling it. We create it by living it. So to live a story that combines hope and doom is to walk courageously into the pain of loss, knowing that there is something worth doing that for. And the best way to do that is to have something in the future that you love that you cannot let be lost. So for all the parents out there, it's the future for your grandchildren not yet born or your great-grandchildren. For the nature lovers, it's the landscapes that have been depleted that will regenerate after you are dead, after you're long gone. So to step into that pain and that loss, and to find the hope that you will never touch, it's a hope you're giving to someone else, is the call to service. And that is the story we experience into being. And as we do it, we'll discover that not knowing was an essential piece of living it.
So, what I'd like you to talk about a little bit now is how do you address the sense of despair and hopelessness that seeps its way into the efforts of those who feel overwhelmed by the barriers they face?
I'm happy to take the first go at this one. Okay. I've done a lot of thinking about this lately and a lot of personal experiencing and wrestling with that kind of dichotomy between fear and hope. And I completely agree. I've long felt like the kind of sort of like hope and rainbows frame that a lot of the bigger green groups have used for the past 10, 20 years. Like, we can do this, you know, there are solutions, which are, you know, it's true, there are solutions, but we can't do this for the people who have already lost their homes. You know, we can't do this for a lot of the South Pacific Islands, for a lot of the West Coast, which is on fire, for the people here on the Gulf Coast who lost their homes just this past week, or who lost their lives. You know, there's already been people who have lost their lives because of climate impacts. And so I do think, and there are places we'll lose, you know, can be completely frank, we'll probably lose where I live, and are already losing. And so you have to be able to wrestle with loss, which of course, which is kind of, I think, in some ways a metaphor for death. And of course, Americans are pretty terrible with wrestling with loss and death, and even anxiety. You know, there's a reason we're one of the most, we have one of the most, you know, highest anxiety and depression and substance use rates in the world. It's because we're not good with pain or uncomfortable feelings. And so I do think that there is this need to, and it's a huge opportunity for faith communities to help people process all of these really difficult emotions. Climate anxiety is a very real thing. I have a lot of friends, and myself included, have gone through serious bouts of depression or anxiety related to working in this field. So I'm not going to tell you that that isn't real or that you might not encounter it. But I think the two things, like, sometimes you just have to let yourself feel the feelings. We did a whole series before this one on Bring the Light called All the Climate Feels, and we interviewed one of the kind of premier psychologists on climate anxiety, and that was a big part. It's like sometimes you just have to sit with it. In the same way that when you lose a loved one, you can't just pretend like everything's good. Like, you have to process that grief, or else it can show up in really dangerous, you know, unhealthy ways. And then secondly, like, a big antidote to climate despair or anxiety is actually showing up, you know, is actually doing something. Because even though we can't save everything or even everyone, we can still save a lot. And there's still so much worth fighting to save for. So coming together in community, taking concrete actions to do something is in itself a solve for anxiety and despair. Because you do realize that it's possible to shut down coal plants, and to clean up coal ash ponds, and to protect communities, and to build more resilient, you know, communities. And I think two, just like last things I'll leave you with, because I could go on and on about the subject, and I encourage you to check out No Place Like Home podcast if you want to hear a lot more about it. But one is, there's a great book that just came out last week called All We Can Save, and it's an anthology of women leaders in the climate movement, some of my best friends, some of the most amazing leaders in the climate movement overall. And it really is, they don't shy away from the danger of where we are and the real choice that we have as humans. You know, we have roughly 7 years to avert the worst impacts of climate, and that is very real. But even if we don't, we still have to fight. You know, we have to fight for a better future for our kids. We have to, you know, we have to fight for the places that we love. And so I think that All We Can Save is a great, beautiful read, and on how we kind of go about wrestling with these hard emotions and dealing with the realities that we're facing, but also, you know, the possibilities that are still before us to kind of live into that future that we want to create. And then I think the other two big things that have given me a lot of, well, courage. One is this essay that inspired the name of this talk that I've held to, is an essay called We Need Courage, Not Hope, to Fight Climate Change, by climate scientist Dr. Kate Marvel, who also contributed to the book All We Can Save. But she basically just reframes it like, we don't necessarily need hope, we need courage. You know, like, one of my favorite Bible stories that's been giving me so much courage lately is not the death of Jesus or even the resurrection of Jesus. It's the, like, days in between where the disciples didn't know what was going to happen. You know, there was just complete darkness and uncertainty, and how we have to lean into that darkness and uncertainty, even if we don't know the outcome. You know, like, I just think when I'm faced with those overwhelming fears, it's like, I could I could check out and go start a farm and like live my days in Western North Carolina, you know, trying to be as happy as I could, or I could, you know, do my best to fight for the things that I left for. And even if I fail, at least I tried. And so that's a big thing. And then I would say the other really big thing giving me hope right now, or courage, is looking to Indigenous voices and also Black and Brown voices, peoples who have been through centuries of oppression, many times where they didn't have any reason to have hope, you know, like, and they still found ways to create community and to share joy and to challenge the systems that were oppressive. I mean, that's true till this day. And so I think looking to leadership of Black and Brown people and Indigenous communities for how to face these giant, scary things is really critical right now. And one of the things that I've been working on the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge for the past year. We just released a documentary called We Don't Give Up, which we released last week. And it's about the Gwich'in, you know, and there's this great line where one of the Gwich'in elders is like, we've been fighting terrorism for like since the white colonists got here, you know, and like this is just like the effort to drill in our sacred lands is just the next phase of it, you know, and we might lose this battle, but we aren't going to give up. And in my mind, if they're willing to not give up and to keep fighting, then we certainly can't either. And looking to their leadership and others who have fought these incredible fights, you know, is really critical for me to kind of find my grounding and really find courage.
You know, your last thought really resonates with me about looking to Native peoples and the Black community. One of the things that has become so apparent to me since the death of George Floyd is the incredible resilience of the Black community in our country. It's really something that I'm newly seeing for the first time. I know it's always been there, but anyway. Michael, what are your thoughts on finding hope or courage in moments of despair?
Yeah. So I'm glad you talked about George Floyd. Before George Floyd mentioned that he couldn't breathe, Eric Garner said that he couldn't breathe. And before he was being choked out because he couldn't breathe, he was already restricted from breathing, from having asthma because of the high pollution that was happening in his community. Being able to breathe is not something, being unable to breathe is not something that's new to the Black experience. We've been experiencing that for over 400 years now. And yes, we are resilient, but we also tired. And we're tired of having to be resilient because the system continues to fail us because it was built to fail us. Where do I find courage now? Two things. I remember and I rejoice. I remember the fact that we've been in this struggle for this long and that we are tired and that, well, I can talk for myself. I'm not going to talk for all of us because I'm not Black people spokesman. I can remember that I'm tired. I can remember how I feel having to fight this fight and seeming to be unseen and unheard. I can remember how it feels to wait for weeks for a verdict to come down and still be told that Breonna Taylor won't get justice, but a wall will. I can remember what it feels like to go to North Birmingham and see the impoverished conditions of a community that is saturated in pollution. I can remember these things, but I can also rejoice in the fact that my faith tells me trouble don't last always. I can rejoice in the fact that we have had some wins, such as the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act. Uh, I can rejoice in those things, and it gives me courage to tell me if we could change it then, we can change it now. If we could just come together and collectively look at the system as being broken and broken on purpose, it was intended to be broken, we can collectively come together and see how to dismantle the system and build a system that is more just and equitable. And here is where my greatest joy comes from right now that gives me courage. And working with young people, because I believe that they've had this vision. They've looked at our past, seeing that they don't want it for their future, and decided that they will change it in their present. And that's exactly what they're doing. And they're cutting through the red tape. They don't want to politicize anything. They want to look at it whether it's right or wrong. And so I invest heavily in my young folk because I really believe, one, it is their world. We're just keepers of it now, and we got it on loan, and our time is coming up real soon. So they do get to name what they want to see for their future, and it's only right that they do so. It's only equitable that they do so. But to see them in mass doing this and seeing this as urgent and seeing this as essential to humanity, and seeing human rights as something that is supposed to just simply be right. This is, I mean, for me, that's what gives me courage right now. And I would advise any community of faith, invest heavily in your youth department. I hate to say it. I don't even argue with Trump supporters at this point. I refuse to. You can listen. I'm here to listen to you, but I'm not here to debate with you or argue with you. And my reason for it is because a lot of them are just, they stuck, and they are where they are, and that there is no changing. Just like a lot of their points that they may bring up, there is no change in me. I see it as wrong. And so that's just not a discussion we need to have anymore. I think we need to put our energy into changing what's to come. Those 13, 14-year-olds who by the time the next election cycle comes around, they'll be ready to vote. Investing in our even younger kids so that they can go home and tell their moms, no, mama, that's not right. No, daddy, that's not right. And start having these conversations in their homes. So it's the young people, and I apologize, I went over, but it's the young people right now that truly, truly gives me hope and courage.
Thank you. We have one question. A viewer wants to know, have either of you, as we are a new organization, are trying to get our name out there a little bit more and our presence felt and known here on the Gulf Coast, are there any news organizations that you guys know of specifically that might be more friendly to our cause that we should reach out to?
That's more of an Anna question. She's more media savvy than I am.
Yeah, it's I'm kind of sad to say that I'm most of my work it takes me elsewhere, although I'm always very happy to come home to the Gulf Coast. So I'm not as familiar with the media landscape down here, but I will say that you'd be surprised how easy it is to get, I mean, I'm sure many of you are already aware of this, how easy it is to get letters to the editor published or even op-eds published in local newspapers. Through just in the same way that you build relationships with local officials. I remember one time when I was working on mountaintop removal, I was organizing churches in Minnesota, which seems strange, but because of the legislative strategy we were working on, there was this one congressman in Jim Oberstar in northern Minnesota that we had to move to get our bill to the floor. And so I went up there to organize churches and also unions. And I just happened to meet with their editor just as a coffee to like get to know each other. And he put it on the front page the next week. And it was like, I wasn't even trying, I was just trying to get to know him because I was working there. So I think starting with the local communities, really mapping out, like I mean, Pensacola is also on the Gulf Coast. I don't know how much you want to go over the the bridge, but I'm sure there's some publications here in Mobile, so yeah, I think that's all. And then as far as like kind of the national faith-based organization or faith-based media that I think would be really interested in this kind of burgeoning network on the Gulf Coast, because people love climate initiatives in the Deep South, because previous to, before recently, there wasn't very many of them. And there needs to be a lot of them because we're on the very front lines of climate justice. And but I know Sojourners would be very interested in this story. The religious news service covers, environmental, kind of faith issues. And anyways, feel free to reach out to me. I actually have quite a few journalist friends who write in this space, and I'd be happy if there is like a certain story that you would like to push to national faith-based media. I'd be happy to get that out. But also I thought that Reverend Malcom's idea about a newsletter, because oftentimes journalists will also subscribe to those to kind of keep tabs on what's happening in the local faith community. So that's one good way of doing it as well. But yeah, happy to brainstorm maybe during a different time, but that's kind of where I would start.
Thank you. Before we wrap up here, are there any topics or thoughts that the two of you wanted to share that you didn't get a chance to share?
If you have social media, please go to the People's Justice Council or Alabama Interfaith Power and Light and follow us. We're energizing Alabama in the South. We've got an event coming up October 22nd and 23rd. We'd love for you all to be a part of it. Again, you can go to our social media, that's Alabama Interfaith Power and Light, or the People's Justice Council. Right now, we're still holding our planning committee meetings, and feel free to jump in with both feet and get them wet and help us to plan this thing out.
Yeah, I would say, first of all, I want to say thank you to Reverend Malcom and to all of you, because when I first started in this field 15 years ago, I couldn't have even talk about living into a new world, or the idea of sitting around a Zoom meeting with a bunch of people on the Gulf Coast of Alabama talking about climate change and faith. It's truly a dream come true. So thank you. And also, yeah, I mentioned the podcast, No Place Like Home. Our last season was on spirituality and climate change, and we have an amazing Indigenous leader. We have Reverend Yearwood from Hip Hop Caucus talking about a lot of the intersections that Reverend Malcom has talked to between kind of Black liberation and climate justice. And then we just have a whole slew of amazing faith leaders, and it's a great season. And then the season before that, on kind of your last question on how to manage difficult emotions, anxiety, despair, we did a whole season on all the climate feels, where we really dig into that. A lot of the reason we created the podcast was to get into not just the science and wonky part of it, but really the human part of it, the stories and the emotions and the spirituality. And so we definitely do get into science sometimes and provide action items on important policies, but we really try to tackle the more kind of heartfelt part of it. So those would be the big ones. I'll share the documentary link with you, Rhoda, if you want to share it around. It really has been a huge source of courage to me over the past week, because that hurricane was traumatizing, both as a resident of the Gulf Coast, but also as a climate activist, and thinking about it, what it means. And, the West Coast is on fire, and it's all just a lot. So yeah, it was one of the things that really gave me a lot of courage this week, and has over the past year. So those are my main thoughts. Thank you so much.
I'll be happy to do that.
Rhoda, thank you for this invitation, and thank you all for listening. One other thing, or two other things that I do want to encourage people to do: vote and fill out your census. Also, let other people know to vote and fill out their census.
Absolutely.
Amen. Amen.
The main things that we can actually do. Anna, Jane, and Michael, thank you for sharing your presence, your knowledge, and your wisdom with us today. I hope our audience found in your conversation a reason to reach for the courage we need to heal ourselves, connect with each other, and begin the work of healing our one and only home. We wish you well, Anna Jane, in your recovery from Hurricane Sally, and to both of you in your work to connect us all. We have been delighted to share this space with you, our audience. If you are in another state or another country, we will remain bonded with you in a mutual yearning for a more compassionate world. If you are here on the Gulf Coast, stay connected with us through our newsletter, website, and Facebook page. We look forward to continuing this work with you. On behalf of Gulf Coast Creation Care, thank you so much for joining us today. Peace and blessing to all of you for the week ahead.